every now and then, Fareed Zakaria of CNN has a take that's pretty good. This is one of those times. So he's talking about how the COVID-19 politicization, it's a hard word. It really comes down to class more than anything else. Let's watch.
If anyone thought a global pandemic that has so far killed more than 85,000 Americans would override the country's partisan divide, think again. It turns out that Democrats are significantly more likely than Republicans to believe that the pandemic is serious and to follow CDC guidelines. Preliminary studies using cell phone data show that people in more Republican areas of the country have been moving around more than in Democratic areas. This has led many to wonder why partisanship has become so strong in the U.S. that people will not listen to experts even at the risk of their own health. But there's a broader distrust that we need to understand. I recognized it while reading a book that is not about COVID-19 at all, but sheds strong light on the situation, explaining why so many people across the West really have rejected the establishment. Michael Lind writes in The New Class War, "The issue is not the issue is power. Social power exists in three realms: government, the economy, and the culture. Each of these three realms of social power is the site of class conflict." Lind argues that the best way to understand America today is through this lens of class conflict, which has been sharpened by the rise of an overclass that dominates the three spheres he mentions. In all three, leaders tend to be urban, college-educated professionals, often with a postgraduate degree, and that makes them quite distinct from much of the rest of the country. Only 36% of Americans have a bachelor's degree, and only 13% have a master's or more. And yet, the top ranks everywhere are filled with this credentialed overclass. For many non-college educated people, especially those living in rural areas, there is a deep alienation from this new elite. They see the overclass as enacting policies that are presented as good for the whole country, but really mostly benefit people from the ruling class, whose lives have gotten better over the past few decades, while the rest are left behind. In this view, trade and immigration, for example, help college-educated professionals who work for multinational companies but hurt blue-collar workers. So when they hear from the experts about the inevitability of globalization and technological change and the need to accept it, they resist. It does not resonate with their lived experience. So let's look at the COVID-19 crisis through this prism. Imagine you're an American who works with his hands, a truck driver, a construction worker, an oil rig mechanic, and you've just lost your job because of the lockdowns, as have over 36 million people. You turn on the television and you hear medical experts, academics, technocrats, journalists explain that we must keep the economy closed. In other words, we must keep you unemployed because public health is important. Now, all these people making the case on TV have jobs, have maintained their standards of living, and in fact are now in greater demand. They feel they're doing important work. You, on the other hand, have lost your job. You feel a sense of worthlessness, and you are terrified about your family's day-to-day survival. Is it so hard to understand why people like this might be skeptical of the experts? The COVID-19 divide is a class divide. The Bureau of Labor Statistics released a report last year on the job flexibilities of U.S. employees. Of the top 25% of income earners, more than 60% can stay home and still do their jobs. Of the bottom 25% of income earners, fewer than 10% can work from home. In the early days of the crisis, only 13% of people in households making over $100,000 were laid off or furloughed, compared to 39% in households making less than $40,000.
Wow. That was something else. So that book that he cites there, I had never heard of it until right now. And that's an interesting theory. He says there's three, I don't know how you describe them, sectors of society, segments of society. There's government power, economic power, and cultural power. And basically there's a class war going on when it comes to the government, when it comes to the economy, and when it comes to the culture. And he goes on to describe why, many people would be skeptical of so-called experts telling us, oh, sorry, you can't go back to work. We got to keep the economy closed. And it is what it is because we're dealing with the pandemic. And you understand more why they feel the way they do when you look at it that way. And the guy's name is Michael Lind. I didn't catch the name of the book there, but that's an interesting theory, and it sounds like an interesting book. But anyway, yeah, what he's talking about there is true. And I've tried to, from the beginning, it's a balancing act because on the one hand, yes, you want to be able to like make fun of people saying dumb things that aren't true and that are silly. Like, for example, there was a story that came out of this One American News Network guy who's appeared. He's like a right-wing media guy. He's appeared on a bunch of, these kinds of outlets like One American News Network. And he was talking about how it's not a good idea to wear a mask because if you wear a mask, you're keeping the germs in your body and you want to get the germs out of your body. So if you're not wearing a mask, you can get the germs out of your body and that's safer. Like you want to be able to make fun of idiots saying idiotic stuff, but at the same time, you want to be clear that a large number of the people who are out there in these like open up protests are people whose economic lives have been destroyed by the pandemic, and they're not getting the help that they need from the government in the form of UBI, and they're not getting the rent freeze and the mortgage freeze, so they feel like they have no option, they have no out but to go back to work, and so all of their anger is then directed at the people who they think are telling them you can't work, namely like the scientists and the doctors and the experts who are saying you can't do it. Now that's misplaced anger. It's not their fault. They're just trying to protect everybody. But you can understand where they're coming from. And, it really is, there's really a strong class divide here. And he lays it out and gives the numbers that the people who are more wealthy are more able to like take an extended period of time off from work and stay home and can still pay the bills and can socially distance and quarantine and be fine. Whereas if you're on the lower end of the economic ladder, you can't afford it. And again, with the government not giving you health care and UBI and a rent freeze and a mortgage freeze or paying your wage for an extended period of time, what are you going to do? There's no out. You have no out. So that's really interesting points there from Fareed Zakaria. And I guess the final point I'll make is just in relation to these open up protests, we have to do that balancing act. We have to be able to make fun of people and when they say silly things and point out how that's wrong and dangerous if you're spreading misinformation about COVID. But also you have to make sure to never go too far in the direction of only mocking, because then you're alienating all the people who are just in pain and trying to get back to some semblance of normalcy and stabilization in their lives economically. So you have to be able to have empathy for the people who deserve the empathy because they have no out, while also making fun of the people spreading misinformation and being total idiots. And that's a hard thing to do. It's a hard thing to do. It's a hard thing to pull that off. But it is also frustrating, though, how we've brought this up on a previous show. There's been 191, probably at this point way over 191 different protests for protective gear, for hazard pay, for frontline workers, for essential workers. And almost none of them got any coverage in the media, but the open up protests, which were largely more right-wingers, that got a hell of a lot more coverage. So it is kind of frustrating, and it's just a fact of reality that we have to deal with, that like nominally left-wing protests to like treat workers fairly and give them hazard pay and protect them by giving them masks on the front line, left-wing protests get no love, no appreciation, no coverage. It's like they're trying to hide it on purpose because they don't want them to take off and maybe be successful. Whereas the right-wing protests, they cover them nonstop. And, I'm sure the reason for covering them varies. I'm sure the motivations of the people covering them vary. Some of them just want to make fun of it. Some don't. But, like, the right-wing protests get a hell of a lot more coverage. And it's a shame because the left-wing protests need that coverage to breathe life into it. And, it's like that story the other day. We're one of only a few outlets that covered it, which is insane. That garbage workers in New Orleans, they were protesting. They're making $10.25 an hour. they were protesting because they're like, you have to give us like masks and protective gear and equipment so that we don't get COVID. And then they were all fired, and New Orleans brought in slaves to do the job, brought in forced prison labor to do the job. How is this not like the number one story in the country? I'll tell you why. It's because we have corporate media. And corporate media is going to look the other way at stuff like that. They just think that's how the system, that's just how it functions. That's just what it is. Not even a story there. Seems like a big story to me. Workers fired and replaced with prison labor because they demanded to at least get some hazard pay and masks. Insanity. But anyway, very rare I say this, but that's a great segment there from CNN host Fareed Zakaria. Every now and then, man, he throws a curveball at you and you're like, all right, not bad. But then, he'll do another segment which is ludicrous soon enough and we'll make fun of it.